Okay, so moving on to point number 7, and this is value and contrast. So if you're here, you're probably already well aware of how important value is in an artwork. Value refers to the lightness to darkness of a color, and essentially, your thumbnails have to make sense in grayscale or in black and white before even giving thought to color. You have to have a nice balance between lights and darks in a drawing or a painting for it to look impactful, visually pleasing, and also for it to have depth, right? And dimension. When you're stemming from a reference photo, you want to make sure that you're able to pinpoint the light source, that you're able to see cast shadows, and that there is a nice balance between lights and shadows, and you're able to see the midtones. All right, so here's the prompt for this one, you guys. You're gonna bring in these two elements into all of your thumbnail sketches. This is a tea kettle, this is a cup of tea, and what I want you to do is you can play with the arrangement of the elements in space with their overlapping, their location in space, their size, etc. But what I want you to focus on for this one is creating interesting use of values. And focus on just using 3. Simplify your values in these, okay? So just work with lightest lights, midtones, and darkest darks. Simplify your values into just 3. Don't try to create perfect gradients or anything like that, but just focus on creating interesting use of different values and light and shadow effects for all of your thumbnail sketches with these 2 elements. I would recommend thinking of the light source first, the location. Where is the light source in relation to your elements after you've drawn them in? And then start by laying down the dark cast shadow opposite to the light source. And then what would happen inside of the elements themselves in terms of values if the light source is hitting them from that direction. I'm gonna use different formats for this one. So maybe the table line is somewhere around here, and my tea kettle. And then maybe my teacup is overlapping the tea kettle. So in this one, perhaps the light is hitting these objects from above them and to the right of them. So that means that the cast shadow would be opposite to the light source on the lower left. So if I have very, very intense light and that cast shadow has a super dark value, that can create very interesting shadows and can create a very just interesting contrast in the piece, having very dark shadows like that. Then perhaps I have a mid-tone in the back wall. Remember to simplify your values. Perhaps the table is a very light color, and maybe inside of the objects themselves I have some midtones as well. And then perhaps some darkest dark values opposite to the light source, pushing the darkest values a little bit more. So there's that first one right there. I thought about the location of the light source and how it would be creating highlights, midtones, and darks in these objects. How it would be creating a cast shadow beneath and to the left of the objects. And just in general, how I would be balancing out different values in order to create a well-balanced, impactful looking piece that has lightest areas, has midtones, and has darkest darks. And this one, how about bringing up the table line? Maybe for this one, the tea kettle is going to be maybe for this one I have 2 teacups, kind of side by side like that, so I can have 3 objects. So that's my positioning of elements in space, and now I give thought to value. So if my light source were hitting the objects from the top left, then I would have, let's just say that it is a very powerful light hitting these objects from the top left. Then I would have very, very dark shadows opposite to the light source, midtones, midtones, opposite to the light source. So this entire section over here would have plenty of midtones. And then I'm going to push the darkest darks. So remember, we want to essentially arrive at an interesting use of value in black and white that you can then turn into color. If your image makes sense in black and white or grayscale and has an impactful look in black and white, then there's much more of a chance that it's going to look good when you add color into the mix. And maybe for this one, I have a very dark wall or section going on over here behind these. And maybe the table or the fabric under the elements is very, very light. So it would have just very light values on it. Let's do one more. And for this, I'm gonna try to make perhaps just part of the kettle is showing here. Maybe it's a zoom in. And I'm gonna try to draw it and going off in the opposite direction. And then maybe for this one, the teacup is here. Okay, so I've decided on location of elements in space. Maybe for this one, the table line, let me bring it up. Okay, so I've decided on the location of elements in my drawing area. Now let me give thought to value. Let me bring in lightest lights, midtones, and darkest darks. So let's say for this one, the light source is again somewhere in the upper right. So this means that the shadows would be created opposite to that on the lower left. Fill that in with an intense cast shadow. So this would have a lot of darkness to it. Just giving thought to like the three-dimensional structure of what I am drawing here. And then a few darkest darks within those midtones. And then let's say that for this one, the table is midtone. Maybe it's dark wood, something like that, that's darker in local value, has a darker local value. I'm considering the tea kettle and the cup to be white, but they could be a darker color, and in those cases, they would have a darker local value. So always consider how the object's local value would play off with the local values of the elements around them. Let's add a very, very dark value over here in the back for this one. For this one, because the objects in this case are white, they would really pop out there because they're surrounded by midtones and darkest darks. 3 very different thumbnail sketches using these same 2 elements and really playing with value and contrast, lights and shadows, giving thought to the location of the light source. So remember that value creates shapes. Because light hits objects, it illuminates objects and creates values throughout them. Values essentially create shapes, right? We have very light shapes, we have midtone shapes, and we have darkest dark shapes. And what's important to realize is that these shapes play with each other and create very interesting relationships and create a lot of contrast. And we have to make sure that we're bringing in all of these into our artwork to create depth and impact. And always give thought to value, because if your thumbnail sketches don't work in black and white or in grayscale, then they're probably not going to work with color either. Once you arrive at something that looks interesting, right? Let's just say that I'm gonna pick out this one and I'm gonna create a painting with this. Well, now that I know it works in black and white, I can go ahead and move on to selecting my colors that I'm gonna be using for this and making sure that I am using the values that I've planned out right here, combining that with color, and that is gonna lead to a much more successful composition than just jumping into color right away.